Just last May, Rishi Sunak could claim that the UK was the fastest growing economy in the G7. And after a fashion, he was correct. Not only this, but UK could see inflation falling close to its target of 2%, and sterling had reached its highest level for 8 years. Were the Tories about to do the same as 1997 and gift Labour an economy ready for a long economic boom? But if all that is true, how come the new Labour government are trying to claim they've inherited the worst ever economy and seem to be insistent on painting a picture of misery and despair? Well, firstly, if we take economic growth, the claim of fast growth is really misleading. We did slightly better than depressed economies for one quarter, but if we look at the wider context, real GDP in the UK is still barely increasing. Now, growth was fast at the start of the year, primarily because we were bouncing back from that recession we had at the end of last year. And since that good start to this year, the economy has kind of gone back to stagnation. The past 2 months have seen zero economic growth, worse than market expectations, and it will be a cautionary lesson for those hoping for a more optimistic UK economic future. It also highlights the danger of just focusing on one economic statistic. And it's also why ordinary people can feel a disconnect between economic statistics and their actual lives. Because despite some positive signs on GDP, the basic fact of the UK economy is that of stagnation of incomes. And in the UK, it's important to look at real GDP per capita, because a growing population has made real GDP sometimes look better than it really is. If we take population into account, real GDP per capita is still lower than in 2019. And it's this that really stands out. It's a worse period for real wage growth in the post-war period. We had got used to rising living standards, and when they fall or even stagnate, it can feel like a recession, even if technically it isn't. However, from another perspective, the macroeconomy does have some positive glimmers on the horizon. It is a genuine relief inflation has fallen close to the government's target. The Bank of England will be particularly happy that services inflation is catching up and coming down too. And this raises the prospect of lower interest rates in the coming months. It may not be that much, but even 0.5% off will give some more confidence to households and maybe even encourage business to start investing after years of very low investment. And don't forget that 18 months ago, there was a genuine fear that interest rates would go up to 6, even 7%. And that led to a big rise in savings as people became very pessimistic and cautious. And in fact, this unusually high level of household savings is one reason why many are hopeful that growth will pick up in the future. Usually the UK economy is pushed along by high spending, high borrowing, basically spending everything we have, maxing out on credit cards. And this makes the UK economy vulnerable to a kind of boom and bust situation like we saw in the early 90s and 2008. But the past couple of years have been quite turbulent, and this has led to a rise in savings as people are more cautionary. And it means that in theory, households with a lot of savings, they would be able to spend when confidence returns. And this would enable higher growth and encourage firms to increase investment too. Also, the fall in inflation means that finally we started to see an increase in real wages, a welcome turnaround from recent years. Now, one thing that business and households dislike is uncertainty, and that's been a big feature of recent years. And the hope is that in the future that there will be greater certainty, less political disasters and things like that. But at the moment, there is still some considerable uncertainty about Labour's first budget. Certainly banks and business and high earners are somewhat nervous about prospective tax rises that they may have to face. And this could explain some of the current weakness in growth and investment. Now, another reason to be more optimistic about long-term economic growth is that, in theory, the UK should have quite a bit of spare capacity. The post-war trend rate of growth was around 2.5%, but with actual growth falling much behind that, in theory we should be able to catch up some of this lost ground. There are some technological improvements coming along which could help increase productivity, much better battery technology, improved solar energy, artificial intelligence, and more automated services. However, hoping for growth to catch up this lost ground is becoming a bit of a cliche, because the story of the past 15 years is optimistic forecasts being proved wrong, and the big story is a continued slump in productivity growth. And this is a big concern. Will Labour government be able to do anything different to change this story, boost productivity, and really boost economic growth? But first, before we look at that, why do Labour say they've inherited the worst economy in the post-war period, when in terms of inflation, economic growth, and unemployment, it definitely isn't true? Well, what they really mean is the state of public finances. And on this grounds, there is merit to say that things are pretty dire. Under the Conservatives, the austerity decade saw taxes as a share of GDP go up. And despite many departments seeing less spending, debt as a share of GDP rose close to 100%. It was kind of the worst of both worlds. Higher taxes, higher debt, and spending barely increased either. And all this means is that any government which worries about balancing the budget has much less room for manoeuvre than it did in the past. And this is especially true in so-called unprotected departments like prisons and justice system and housing. And this is why there's a real crisis with prisoners being released early and why there's such a backlog of court cases. Now, the problem is that the UK does have an ageing population. Demand for healthcare is rising faster than the economy is growing. It's not just an ageing population, but a decline in healthy life expectancy and an increased cost of modern medicine. Now, across the world, you see taxes rising as a share of GDP. By international comparison, or certainly in Europe, UK is not particularly high. But with a government ruling out major tax increases, they are left scrambling around for ways to save money. In the post-war period, of course, we could afford to increase health spending by reducing defence spending. But that free meal has really come to an end because, if anything, defence spending needs to go back up again. And it's become an almost impossible juggling act to keep up with demand for public spending. For example, there's been a fierce backlash to removing winter fuel discounts of pensioners. But at around £1.6 billion a year, it's really a drop in the ocean compared to the expected rise in pension spending that will come in future years. Now, the biggest problem perhaps is NHS waiting lists have risen to 7 million, with some thinking it could be even higher. It will prove very difficult to sort the problems in healthcare, and even just spending more money is not necessarily enough. Now, to meet fiscal rules in recent years, the government's often resorted to cutting public sector investment, because this is the easiest short-term fix. But it stores up problems for the long term. Poor infrastructure, crumbling schools, energy dependency on imports, all this has resulted in problems such as congestion, potholes on the roads, and lack of affordable housing. And this is the real economy for ordinary people, and why GDP statistics can seem somewhat irrelevant if you can't get a doctor's appointment or afford to pay your rent. Now, the new government are really caught between wanting to increase investment and wanting to meet fiscal rules. On the one hand, they're trying to boost housing supply and they've created Great British Energy, but on the other hand, they've scaled back some infrastructure projects and tried to reduce spending on things like winter fuel discounts. At the end of the day, the government's public investment plans are really very modest, not that much different to the last government. The government seems to be leaning more towards, you could say, Treasury orthodoxy of trying to balance the budgets. It seems almost their mantra is, we can't afford it. So there is a danger, I think, of the UK repeating a similar cycle of austerity and low growth we saw 14 years. We'll have to see. But I think the government would be better advised to focus on increasing investment rather than worrying too much about fiscal rules, which are of debatable value. But it's always important to bear in mind that governments are not all powerful and the economy is influenced by many forces beyond its control. On the positive side, oil prices have been falling and this will help to reduce inflation. But this really reflects an increased risk of a global recession, and this would be very damaging for the UK economy, where exports are still an important part of the economy. The whole of Western Europe is struggling to grow. Even the US, which has achieved impressive economic growth in recent years, is starting to stutter with some recession warning signals. The recent EU report by Mario Draghi laid bare the lack of dynamism, flexibility and willingness to invest in Western Europe. The German economy is really stuttering along, barely escaping recession. And it's really no comfort to say we are growing marginally less badly than the German economy. Because ultimately, if the German economy does badly, it will negatively affect the whole European economy, including the UK. Because despite Brexit, the UK still is influenced by what happens on the continent. In fact, the decline of the German economy has many parallels to what's happening in the UK. And this video explains what has gone wrong and why it really matters. So do check it out. Thanks a lot.